So the United States has existed in its current form as the global dominant superpower and the holder of the global reserve currency basically since World War II. And they actually signed the document at Bretton Woods. They said that the United States dollar would be in control. And you wrote the other day, James, about how the UK's representative, John Maynard Keynes, this famous economist, basically was pretty upset about some of the things, some of the demands that the United States was making. And in the end, he ended up signing anyway. So what made it so that the United States could set all these terms and held all the cards at Bretton Woods back in 1944?
Oh, you got to go back to history for a lot of it. I mean, the idea of a reserve currency is nothing new. It wasn't invented in 1944. You go back to the days of Alexander the Great, when Alexander the Great went and conquered so much of the world, and he took silver, Greek drachma, silver coins, and scattered them around everywhere. And that kind of became the de facto reserve currency. It was the idea that one group would conduct its kind of commerce and trade with other groups using this other currency that might not even belong to either one of them. The same way that, again, like today, Australia does business with Japan and they'll settle that deal in US dollars. That's basically what a reserve currency is. And that's a very old concept. The Roman denarius, the Byzantine gold solidus, the Venetian ducat, the Florentine florin, Spanish real de ocho, Dutch guilder, and the British pound. The British pound was in the 80s basically the dominant reserve currency, but it was also at a unique time in history because you had this thing called the classical gold standard. And we've discussed this before, and it's actually Germany that kind of put everybody over the edge. Germany got together in the 80s, basically signed some papers and said, let there be Germany. And they cobbled together all these German kingdoms. It was kind of a unique instance in history of that happening. And they decided pretty early on that they were going to have a gold standard, that there would be sort of paper currency backed by gold. And that's really when this classical gold standard took off. Britain, though, at the time was basically responsible for 60 some odd % of all global trade was invoiced in British pounds. I mean, it was a really, really big number, right? So 60% of global trade being invoiced in British pounds is much more than the US dollar today. So that's
what I was going to say. And I don't know what the peak of the US dollar trade, global trade being done in the US dollar was, but it was probably not more than that.
Well, early stage, Bretton Woods, it would have been, but as of today, right now, for example, it's a lot less than 60%. So Britain had a greater share, the British pound had a greater share of global trade than the US dollar in the 1800s than the US dollar does today. So that's kind of interesting. It ended in World War I because going into World War I, all these countries, they knew it was going to happen. They needed lots and lots of money. Britain was already kind of late stage empire in decline by 1914. And so Britain broke the gold standard. They basically eliminated the gold standard. On the eve of World War I, Great Britain's debt to GDP ratio was like 30%. Okay, so they had to break the gold standard in order to pay for World War I. They suffered, their economy suffered dramatically. They had inflation. They had a lot of problems. You fast forward 30 years, from before World War I to the end of World War II, they went from 30% of GDP for their national debt to 240% of GDP. While the US still had a gold standard, it had been modified by Franklin Roosevelt, but they still had a gold standard. They still had, basically at that point, the world's largest economy. They had the world's largest manufacturing base that hadn't been ravaged by war. And so it was just obvious in 1944, the summer of 1944, that number one, there needed to be a new financial system. Number two, it's just obvious that the US was going to be at the head of it. And there's a really, really great book. It's called The Battle for Bretton Woods. And the author takes what should be an incredibly boring subject, actually makes it really exciting. It's one of the very, very well-written book, and it goes into some excruciating detail about what actually went down in the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And the idea was that they called this conference. It wasn't the first one that they did. They had another one just, I think, a couple of months before, maybe even the month before, that they had in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and they got together and they hammered out some of the pre-details of this. And they got together kind of formally in July 1944, I'm sorry. And at that point, the D-Day Normandy invasion had already proven to be a success. Hitler was on the ropes. And everybody knew World War II was coming to an end. And Roosevelt went out and said, we've got to firm up this peace. We've got to figure out what the future is going to look like. And he was very polite. He didn't attend the conference in person, but he sent this message and it was read aloud to all the attendees. And it was very polite, and it kind of implied that there's going to be cooperation and we're going to discuss this and we're going to negotiate. But there was no real discussion. There was no negotiation. It was a coronation, They were dictating, the Americans were dictating, this is what the system's going to be. And you guys, everybody in this room is like 700 some odd delegates. You got 3 weeks to sign up. That's the deal. Because after 3 weeks, Keynes actually lamented this. He said, well, we kind of had to sign it because all the Americans are going to kick us out of the hotel. We were going to be homeless. We were going to be, without food and water and bath and all these things. And so we basically had to sign it. And these guys didn't even give us a clean copy of the agreement to finally read through. So we just sort of forced into signing it. He kind of made it seem like the Americans had a gun to his head. And he wasn't very happy
what if
about
they
it.
didn't sign it? Like, what did it actually force them to do? To start using US dollars?
There are a number of things about it in the Bretton Woods Treaty. One of the things Roosevelt said was he said, economic diseases are highly contagious. And what starts in one country can easily spread to another. And that's a true statement. I mean, I have a lot of issues with Roosevelt, but I mean, that was a true statement. And one of the things that they realized, there was an era prior to that of trade restrictions, trade wars, tariffs, right? You go back to Smoot-Hawley and all throughout the 1930s and these sort of tariffs that created these trade wars that really debilitated the global economy, really helped fan the flames of the Great Depression. And they said, we got to get away from this. We got to get back to free trade. And the Americans are so adamant about free trade that this is one of the things that made Keynes furious. Keynes was a really famous guy. He was basically like Einstein in the way that Einstein was, yes, he was a physicist, but he transcended his profession. Keynes was an economist, but he was a household name. People knew about John Maynard Keynes who didn't study economics. That's how famous he was. I mean, it's like in the same way that people that have never watched a basketball game in their entire lives know who Michael Jordan is or LeBron James, right? So he became kind of a cultural icon of sorts and one of the most famous guys in Britain. So he shows up and everybody's hanging on to every word that he says. He's getting photographed everywhere. Everybody's glad handing and just standing in line just to shake hands with a great man. And he's furious about it because one of the things that the Americans insisted on was free trade, including with English colonies. So you had something like British Honduras or some of the islands in the Caribbean, which were British colonies. And at the time, the trade rights was that those islands or colonies could trade exclusively with Great Britain and nobody else. And the Americans said, no, there's going to be free trade in those places too. And Keynes was furious. He said, you want to take away our exclusive rights to trade with our own colonies? And the Americans said, yes. And Keynes was furious. He blew up. He was in the Mount Washington Hotel screaming at the U.S. representatives, at the deputy to the U.S. Secretary of State who had brought this demand. He was screaming at these guys.
He actually thought this was just better for the UK, or he thought that was actually better somehow economically. It seems kind of ignorant as an economist to be like, or he just didn't care if it was bad for the colonies.
He wasn't there for the global economy. He was there representing Britain. So what was in Britain's best interest was to have exclusive trade rights with its colonies. Keynes didn't give a damn about what was good for the global economy or the
loss
economy.
Of sovereignty that he was concerned about. Not
Absolutely. And the whole point was that every single day in that conference was a constant humiliating reminder to John Maynard Keynes that the New World Order was going to have nothing to do with Great Britain.
The sun had set on the British Empire.
The sun had set, and it was America's show. It was 1944, and it was Game America on from that point forward. And every day was being shoved in the face of Britain and really the world's most preeminent economist and economic mind. And so he was furious throughout all of it, but what could he do? Nothing. So he ended up signing it. He had to sign it.
And I mean, America had just saved Europe's ass in World War II, or was in the process of still doing so. And Europe was in shambles and they had no manufacturing capabilities. That must have played into how America had all the cards as well, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, look, the U.S. turning the tide of the war didn't start in 1944, right? I mean, you got to think about the Africa campaign and coming into Italy and so many things in which the arrival of the United States really did turn the tide of the war. The Normandy invasion, at least for the war in Europe, was one of the last pieces of that. But the U.S. had been really calling the shots in the war for a long time, and everybody knew it. I mean, it was one of the things that frustrated Keynes was that Winston Churchill kept having to, go across the pond, kept having to have these meetings, begging the Americans, please give us money, please give us money. He was just kind of groveling at that point. There was almost no dignity left in Britain anymore because they just had such need for funds and resources and armament and weapons and munitions and all these things. So Keynes felt like he was negotiating with both hands tied behind his back. He also, to be completely frank, was a little bit outclassed. And then there's a lot of really interesting material in this book kind of talking about like the things that he could have done if he had realized. He could have sort of pitted different American interests against one another, interests from the bankers versus interests from the government, and see that those interests weren't necessarily aligned, and he could have kind of pitted them against each other. But he just didn't, either he didn't do it, he didn't realize that he had the capability to do that. And so he ended up signing a deal that was pretty crappy for the UK. But the Americans believed that, yeah, sure, it was a good deal for them, but they also believed that what was good for the United States was good for the world. And that they went around and promised everybody, the United States at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, promised the world, trust us, we will be responsible custodians of the dollar, the world's global reserve currency. We will take care, we will treat it well, we will treat you well, we'll be fair and kind and benevolent and all these things. And everybody said, oh, wow, yeah, sounds great. And so they all signed it, and most of those countries were just happy to be invited. There's actually a story. I can tell you, there's a story about, the New Yorker and the New York Times, and everybody's reporting on this. And they said, it's just so odd to see in this little mountain town in New Hampshire, to see Chinese people and to see, Ethiopians and to see, people from Poland and in South Americans, you have Chileans and, Argentines or whatever there. It's like just so odd to see all that. And there was a story about the Chinese delegation. They went for a hike up in the mountains. And this is in 1944. And there was some hermit, some New Hampshire kind of live free or die hermit who had been living in the mountains and didn't know anything about that this global monetary conference was going on in his town. And he's like, this guy's like living out in the wilderness in the mountains. And he sees these Chinese people come out, of course, mistakes them for Japanese, couldn't really tell the difference. And he jumps out
getting invaded.
Jumps out with his rifle and thinks that either America's getting invaded or they're Japanese spies that are here, whatever. Like all the authorities had to come out and talk this guy off the ledge and go, no, they're like this official Chinese delegation here to negotiate a new financial system way above this guy's head. But I mean, it was just all these oddball stories. One of my favorite ones was John Maynard Keynes' wife, who was this famous Russian-born ballerina dancer. And they were staying in the floor in the suite, literally just above the U.S. Treasury Secretary. And she used to do all of her dance moves at night. She was doing her grand jetés and her pirouettes and all these things, making all this noise, jumping up and down, keeping the Treasury Secretary up at night. Probably just out of spite, because they were, she and her husband were both so furious about this whole thing. She didn't have a very good time, but the hotel was constantly complaining about this hotel. But it was interesting. I mean, they did it at this hotel, the Mount Washington Hotel, because part of it was a political favor, right? Roosevelt knew there was a guy, I think a congressman or a senator from New Hampshire, was kind of on the ropes politically and needed like this win. And so they did it in New Hampshire. And the only place they could do it in the entire state of New Hampshire was at the Mount Washington Hotel, because it was literally the biggest. It was one of these kind of Gilded Age treasures that some super rich speculator came in and built this giant hotel. I mean, it's just enormous. It's enormous. And it was the biggest building in all of New Hampshire. I said, well, that's the place. We're going to do it in New Hampshire. It is a political favor to this guy, and it's literally the only place we can do it. And they had 3 weeks to get it done because, towards the end of July, all the wealthy people from Boston would come up and basically fill up the hotel. So they had to kick all the delegates out for the wealthy guests from Boston that were coming up. So it was a really interesting story.
Fair, though, about what was signed there, it did work out pretty well for the rest of the world for quite some time. The United States was patrolling the seas. Countries that were enemies before could now trade with each other and just had a much better relationship.
The U.S. patrolling the seas wasn't part of the deal.
It wasn't.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't this explicit guarantee of America's going to be the world's policeman. That wasn't part of the deal. The deal was we're going to have free trade. Everybody's going to use the dollar. Everybody's going to fix their currency to US dollars, and we're going to fix the dollar to gold. And that's how you can rely on the dollar. And it was just this idea of like America being the world's policeman took place over time. The next step in the process was obviously everybody goes, well, how the hell are we going to get our hands on all these dollars? And that's when they unveiled the Marshall Plan, where they shoveled, the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars all over the world to help people rebuild after World War II. And so that's sort of the seeds of US dollars, like all over the world. It was, the system was, let's say, stable, and it worked very well for a lot of countries that managed to recover very quickly. Japan obviously managed to recover very quickly. Germany managed to recover very quickly. A lot of places recovered very quickly through that system. The US had, really quite a strong economic showing after World War II. It had some recessions here and there, but I mean, in the early 1960s, things in general were going fairly well. And I don't think there are a whole lot of people that would have stood back and really complained about Bretton Woods and said, oh, this is a horrible system. And it was only in the 1960s when all of a sudden you had the cost of the Vietnam War, the cost of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, had all this government spending, deficits piling up through the roof. You had a much larger U.S. government bureaucracy at that point. Did things start to change and people started to question that system?
Was Vietnam and Korea, was this part of maintaining that same system that had been signed at Bretton Woods? Was the United States going to war? I know it was sort of to stop the spread of communism. So
that's really what it was. I mean, they had this idea that if one country becomes communist and they're all going to become communist, they call it the domino theory. And this is one of, people wrote their PhD dissertations about this, and they repeated it enough times that it became axiomatic through repetition. People just kind of believed it. The reality is that communism, this is my opinion. I mean, I've traveled to 123 countries around the world. Like, I think socialist tendencies tend to pervade when there's significant income inequality and people don't understand the roots of the income inequality. And so whenever you have one group of people that's doing very well and another group of people that's not doing very well, human beings generally naturally tend to gravitate towards socialism. And socialism kind of begets communism. I mean, socialism is more of an economic system. Communism is more of a government system, is sort of the way I outline the distinction between the two, versus Marxism is kind of a pure philosophy of sorts. But socialism, people gravitate towards that because they feel like they want to be treated more fairly, and then they get it and they realize that it's a great way to make everybody poor. And the thing that finally rids the world of communism, rids the world of socialism, is socialism itself. And people realize they don't want to live under that anymore, and eventually capitalism wins. And that was kind of the funny thing, that they lost the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese took over, communism took over. And I remember the first time I was in Vietnam and I saw all these McDonald's and Starbucks or whatever everywhere, and it's like, yeah, because capitalism always wins.
That's an interesting thing to think about. Obviously, there's a huge contrast between North Korea and South Korea, but there's also a huge contrast between Vietnam and North Korea. And you start wondering, was the Vietnam War even worth fighting to push them back? Would Vietnam, in the end, ended up being pretty...
Well, I mean, communism always fails. I mean, that's the whole point. Communism always fails. I mean, people try it. They're completely mistaken and naive. They think, oh, this time's going to be different, but it always fails. And at the end, everybody wants capitalism because capitalism is where the prosperity's at. And that's basically the reason why the United States became the most prosperous country in the world.
But those were some of the things that the United States was spending money on that was in like you said, great society. And so it was costing a lot of money to maintain this global reserve status. Is that...
Well, it became, I mean, the U.S. became very, in that respect, very socialist. We said, we're going to engineer an end to poverty through central planning and government spending. And that's what the Great Society really was. So they invented all these things, all these, different entitlement programs, different welfare and so forth that were not only very expensive, but also counterproductive. Very counterproductive. They didn't actually eradicate poverty at all. If you look at the results of a lot of these Great Society programs, they've been very self-destructive. And so the government spending, U.S. deficits became quite high, running all these domestic entitlement programs simultaneously with an extremely expensive war, having 500,000 people deployed overseas in Vietnam, with no clear war strategy. And we're just, the idea is just we're going to spend money and all. I mean, it was very, very expensive. And so in the 1960s, mid 1960s, Richard Nixon's the guy who always gets the blame for this, for people that are kind of in the know, but it was actually Lyndon Johnson was the guy that campaigned very heavily, lobbied Congress very heavily for an end to the gold standard. And it's funny, I actually went and read all these congressional hearings, committees and subcommittee transcripts. And the guy who was Treasury Secretary at the time, Henry Fowler, he laid out all these arguments, and he sort of represented the expert class at the time, and these people that believed that gold was holding the dollar back, that the gold standard of Bretton Woods was negative for the dollar. They insisted that the dollar was actually propping gold up, not the other way around, not that gold was anchoring the value of the dollar. They said, no. The dollar, we owe it to the world to liberate the dollar from the gold standard. The world needs the US dollar off of the gold standard. The world's depending on us. And it was funny. I was having this conversation with Peter Schiff, my very dear friend and partner, and Peter's dad. He was telling me, I didn't know this. He was telling me, my dad went and testified to Congress. Peter Schiff's dad went and testified to Congress, I think in 1968, about this law that they wanted to pass to authorize the president to decouple gold and the US dollar. And Erwin Schiff was like, you people are insane. You're talking about the dollar, that gold is, the dollar is holding gold up. It's the other way around. Don't you understand? If you decouple these two, there's going to be inflation, there's going to be recession, there's going to be stagflation, there's going to be all these things. And of course, Irwin Schiff was right. And the experts in Washington had it all wrong. And so they went ahead and they passed this law, I think in 1968, I think it was like late 1968. Lyndon Johnson signed it into law. And the law basically said at the time, what they called the gold cover was essentially the backing of gold to the US dollar relative to the Federal Reserve, the central bank, all their US dollar liability money supply at the central bank had to be 25%. And at the time that they passed it, they passed that law, it was like 25.00000 something percent. So it was like right at that level. And they basically said the president can authorize the Federal Reserve to basically like take that away. So you don't have to maintain that gold cover reserve anymore. But the guy that actually did it was Richard Nixon. It wasn't until a couple of years later, Johnson didn't run for re-election. Nixon ended up becoming the president. And it was Nixon who a couple of years later actually utilized the authority under that law and closed the gold window, as they say, and basically eliminated that gold coverage. And that's really where Bretton Woods, the first iteration of Bretton Woods, ultimately died. I mean, at that point, it was only like 20 some odd years, really, from 1944 to the early 1970s, 26, 27 years for that happened. So, I mean, that initial financial system didn't really last all that long until all of a sudden the dollar was backed by nothing. And it turned out all the experts who said, oh, the dollar is holding gold up, the dollar is propping up gold, and we owe it to the world to decouple the two. Well, it turned out that the world was furious. And everybody's sitting around going, what are these pieces of paper I'm holding? What is this? It's backed by nothing. I don't want to have anything to do with this anymore. And it became a real issue for not only the US, but the world.
Well, but obviously the dollar didn't lose its global reserve status. So what happened to allow the United States to maintain it after devaluing it?
Yeah, we talked about this before. You had that famous remark by John Connally, who was then Treasury Secretary for Nixon. He was the governor of Texas who had gotten shot sitting next to John F. Kennedy in that fateful November 1963. He recovered, ended up becoming Treasury Secretary. Nixon sends him to Rome and meets with these bewildered, European allies, and he says the dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. And he was right. And it's kind of like, the old saying, it's like, if you owe the bank $1 million and you can't pay, you have a problem. If you owe the bank $100 billion and can't pay, the bank has a problem. It's kind of the equivalent. The dollar in the early 1970s was kind of that equivalent. It's like, you guys own whatever, hundreds of billions. I mean, in today's terms, trillions of dollars worth of US government bonds of US dollars. This is your problem, not our problem. What are you guys going to do about it? Because this is you owe the bank $100 billion. It's the bank's problem. Like, they own so much US dollar reserves. It was the Europeans, it was the Japanese, it was the Australians. These are the guys who actually had the problem. The other thing that they did, though, the US did, I think was a very clever strategic move, was they went to Saudi Arabia in the 1970s and they said, listen, you got the oil. Everybody knows it. Everybody needs it. We want you to sell oil in US dollars. And if you do that, we'll guarantee you security. We'll guarantee you US military security. Now, if you're an incredibly corrupt royal regime whose only priority is to remain in power at all costs, and the largest military superpower in the world promises you the US Marine Corps in case you get in trouble, you take that deal, right? That's a good deal for you. So ultimately, that's
you
what
don't really
that's what
lose
Saudi
anything. You're still getting paid for your products. You're just accepting US dollars for oil instead of a whole bunch of different currencies from whatever country's buying.
So Saudis ended up pegging their currency really to the US dollar and accepting US dollar for trade. And so it was convertible into their Saudi rial. They started holding lots and lots of US government bonds. They ended up eventually changing the tax law actually to make it so that interest payments on U.S. government bonds to foreigners would be tax-free because it said, listen, come on, man, we're buying your bonds, we're financing your debt. The least you could do is not tax us on the interest that you're paying us. And the government said, all right. So they ended up changing the tax laws over that to, in part, accommodate Saudi Arabia. But that move created what's called the petrodollar. They went to Saudi Arabia and said, we will guarantee you security if you sell oil in U.S. dollars. They call this the petrodollar because now the idea is that, look, everybody in the world needs oil. And everybody's buying it from Saudi Arabia, especially back in the 70s, which means that if you want to buy oil, Saudi's selling it in US dollars, you got to hold dollars. Where do you get the dollars from? Well, you got to hold dollars from the United States. You got to buy US government bonds. So they basically engineered artificial demand. So they went and they said, oh, are you still pissed off about us taking the dollar off the gold standard? Well, guess what? Now you can't buy oil unless you hold US dollars. And so they created this artificial demand by sort of engineering the petrodollar. At the same time, the other thing that the US had going for it was the fact that, they're also like, what are you going to do? Who's going to be the reserve currency? Italy? Ha. France? Ha. Nobody else. I mean, there was no like Europe, there was no euro, there was no any of these things. The best thing you had going was the Deutschmark. But even the German economy was still too small to be able to withstand global trade and capital flows. The only economy that had sufficient size and scale, the only currency where there was enough money out there was the US dollar, was the United States. And so based on that and the fact that they engineered the petrodollar, people just kind of went, whatever. And they complained and they grumbled, but they kept using US dollars. And that's the way it's been for a long time.
They had to buy US debt to hold those US dollars. That's how.
That's typically how governments to this day, that's typically how they own US dollars. Foreign governments and central banks, they don't buy, Tesla stock. They buy US government bonds. Simply because I've kind of joked about this before, like there's no central banker in the world that's sitting on, a US 10-year note and saying, man, how am I going to get rid of these US treasuries? Like it's just super, 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 it's the most liquid asset in the world. You can turn around and sell US treasuries and get cash for it. You can trade it for stuff. It's actually considered at that sort of supranational, international global level. US, I mean, even in accounting terms on like balance sheets for large corporations, US government bonds are considered a cash equivalent. If you have a $100 bond and $100 in cash, in accounting and finance, those are considered the same thing. And quite often, governments might actually settle trade by trading bonds with one another as opposed to like currency and US dollar bank transfers. They could just settle in US government bonds. So bonds are actually considered a cash equivalent. And because that financial infrastructure had existed for so long, since the 1940s, people said, all right, whatever, we'll just keep doing it. We'll just keep using these US government bonds. So even though they took the dollar off the gold standard, people didn't like it, but they kept using US dollars and have so for decades.
When it was on the gold standard, they were still acquiring those US dollars as bonds?
Yeah, I mean, because the US, this is the interesting thing about it. Like there was a kind of an obscure economist who lived back then, and his name was Robert Triffin. And he posited this thing. It's known in economics as Triffin's dilemma. And the idea is that the bottom line is that nobody can last as the global reserve currency. And he explained why. The idea is that if you're the global reserve currency, you have US dollars as the global reserve currency. Well, if your global economy is growing, then kind of by definition, the global reserve currency, the supply of US dollars needs to grow with it, right? Because if the global economy is growing, every year we're producing more and more goods and services. We're producing more iron and steel and copper and automobiles and personal computers and all these things. And we're producing more and more and more. And we're trading with one another and our trade is growing. Well, we need the reserve currency in order to trade, right? We need those US dollars. And so if trade is growing, the economy is growing, we need more US dollars alongside that growing trade. So like
the alternative would be to just let the US dollar become more valuable.
Well, no, they're never going to do that. That would be deflationary. So that's like cancer to economy. I mean, they don't have deflation.
Deflation, so it's good for the money in your bank account, bad for borrowing.
We like deflation. We go to the grocery store. We like to see falling prices, but economists, the only people that don't like inflation have PhDs in economics. You got to go to school and study so hard that you forget common sense and start going, no, the only thing that's good is rising prices, not falling prices. I mean, these people are insane. And so this is what happened with this guy, Robert Triffin. He realized that growing trade, if trade grows by 5%, that means we need 5% more US dollars. So where are you going to get 5% more US dollars from? Well, the only way you can do that is that the central bank goes poof, and they conjure more US dollars out of thin air, or The government, the US government, just goes into debt. And by going into debt, they're essentially creating that money, right? Because they're borrowing it from the future, taking money from the future and bringing it into today. So creating that money. So essentially, the need to increase trade, the need to grow the global economy means you need more US dollars. More US dollars means that you have to run budget deficits. It means you have to basically print money and have inflation. And so what Triffin said is this, well, wait a minute. If you're constantly running budget deficits, if you're constantly running trade deficits in order to create more US dollars simply to facilitate global economic growth, then eventually all that debt, all those deficits you accumulate is going to make your country so unattractive that people aren't going to want to use your currency anymore.
So it's a catch-22. Eventually, you have to be irresponsible in order to maintain the reserve, but then that irresponsibility ends up costing you in the end.
Costing you the reserve. It means people don't want to have your reserve anymore because you've been so irresponsible, but you had to be irresponsible in order to maintain the reserve status. So it's a weird catch-22. It's called Triffin's dilemma, and it's playing out. Now we can see it in real time. We can see decades and decades of bad decisions that has resulted in a $36+ trillion US national debt, $2 trillion in annual budget deficits, $1.1 trillion just to pay interest on the debt, which exceeds national defense spending. I mean, it's a complete and total disaster.
While it was sort of odd that it went on for that long without any major inflation. I was thinking this during the Obama era when they had the bailouts of the banks, and that was only $800 billion back then. But it was kind of confusing why there wasn't more inflation. And basically this is why, because there's a global demand for dollars for that debt in order to hold the US dollar. So that's that extreme privilege that the United States has had by holding.
Well, the part that you're missing is like, what were people doing with those dollars, right? So those dollars ended up in the hands of foreigners and banks and all sorts of different people, all sorts of different parties in the US and all over the world, right? The government, the central bank was printing all this money. They bailed out the banks. The government was spending all this money. And where did all those dollars end up? They ended up in the stock market. People went and basically took those dollars and they bought assets. And so this is where you started seeing skyrocketing asset prices, price earnings valuations going to the roof, cyclically adjusted price earnings, price book ratios.
So it was inflation, it was just asset inflation, not
It was asset inflation.
Okay.
It was asset inflation.
That's why everybody's house. You look back at what your parents bought in the 70s, and you had this like 4-bedroom, 4-bath house for $100,000 or something.
Yeah. I bought my first house in 2001. I paid $85,000. $84,999 is what I paid for it. I got a VA loan because I was in the military at the time, so I put no money down, and my interest rate at the time was 7.25%. No money down, 7.25%. I only got that no money down because I was in the military. The guy who sold it to me, he pulled me aside and he said, "I just want you to know what a crazy good deal you got on that interest rate." Because 7.25% was like, people were like, whoa. Because I mean, they were used to, the guy was telling me, he's like, when I just sold you the house, like I was paying 9%. And I refinanced to get 9% because when I first bought this house in the 80s, the interest rate, I was paying 16%.
My parents were 17 or 18% in the 84 or 85, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. My parents too. I mean, it was brutal. And that's what they had to do in the 80s to arrest the inflation of the 1970s, was to jack interest rates up to the moon, basically caused a pretty severe recession. And one of the things that ultimately got the US out of that was kind of a technology fueled productivity boom. And I will probably talk about that here at the conclusion of this.
Well, it's actually kind of an interesting point, the fact that you needed the higher rates in order to get the US out of that, because then instead of pouring the money into the stock market, like you said was just happening, we had that asset price inflation. People started to look at the bonds and say, well, 15%. I mean, why?
I can loan money to the US government. I can loan money to the US government and get this risk-free rate of 15%. Who the hell's not going to do that? Yeah, sure. At the time, the rate of inflation was high. I mean, 9%, 10%. But I mean, man, you're still getting 15%. So like after inflation, you're doing very well. If you locked in that rate for 30 years, I mean, imagine how well you were doing when inflation went down to 3%, 2%, 1%, and you're still making 15% for 30 years on US government bonds. I mean, it's a pretty big deal.
Well, do you think that's going to happen again? I mean, because now we're in the same sort of position as the 70s. And so is the United States going to do the responsible thing, jack up interest rates, maybe cause a recession, but then coax that money out of the stock market and into bonds in order to finance its debt?
The difference is that the government could afford to do that in the early 90s because the level of debt in the United States was low enough. It was still, I mean, Ronald Reagan thought it was way too high. I mean, even Bill Clinton thought it was way too high. I mean, Bill Clinton, supposed to be supposed to be on the left, but I mean, Bill Clinton was like very concerned about the U.S. government debt and really worked to try and balance the budget and actually managed to succeed in doing that, ran a little budget surplus for a couple of years. Even with all that, though, I mean, interest rates again in the 90s were 7-8% for U.S. government debt. I don't think today the U.S. can afford those kind of high rates. I mean, there's just no way. You got $36 trillion in debt. The average rate on that $36 trillion in debt is about 3.3% right now. And by the way, that's up from like 1.3% just a couple of years ago. If you go back to February of 2022, the average interest rate on all the marketable U.S. government debt was, like 1.3%. Today it's 3.3%. So you talk about, a full 2% higher, right? Which means that like for every $10 trillion of debt, it costs you an extra $200 billion a year just to pay interest, right? So based on that, if we're sitting at 3.3% as an average rate right now, and remember, the vast majority of all the U.S. government debt is going to mature over the next couple of years. It's going to have to be refinanced. If interest rates go to, I mean, forget about 15%. I mean, if interest rates go to 7, 8%, I mean, you're talking about, 8% on $36 trillion. I mean, what is that? Like $2.8 trillion a year just to pay interest. Just to pay interest. And then you got a couple $1 trillion for Social Security and Medicare. I mean, you're already running a budget deficit at that point. You're running a significant budget deficit, and you haven't even paid for your mandatory entitlements yet, let alone the military, let alone, all the other things we think of as government, from the national parks to Homeland Security and all these different things. So there's no way you can't have a $36 trillion debt. You can't have a debt level that's 130%, 125% of GDP and pay 7% interest on it. I mean, the only way you can do that is if you have this really, really low, super cheap interest rate, which is kind of what seems to be why these guys are pushing this, quote unquote, Mar-a-Lago Accord to try and reduce those interest rates and get people to look the other way.
Well, that's what their solution is going to be. This is because it sounds like we're at the end of this Triffin's dilemma thing, and now the debt is becoming unattractive because of this decades of irresponsibility. So now the Trump administration is trying to reset the financial system again. So we had the Bretton Woods, and it was gold based, and then it was Saudi oil based.
You had the Bretton Woods system, then you had the Nixon Saudi system. Now there clearly seems to be a concerted effort, a deliberate effort to re-alter, to adjust the financial system fundamentally. Again, a couple months ago, this idea floating around. There's an advisor to Donald Trump, his economic advisor. His name is Stephen Moran, and he started writing about this stuff. And he kind of called it the Mar-a-Lago Accord, the idea that, hey, there'll be a new financial system. And here's the deal. And the basic tenet is, we talked about this before, but basic tenet is to create a sort of new union, a new club of nations, so to speak. And if you're in the club, then you get access to the dollar. You get access to this very wonderful, lucrative U.S. consumer market. You get access, you get commitments of security that, hey, you get into trouble, we'll send the Marines after you and all that stuff. But sure, you got to pay for that. And one of the things that you got to pay up is you're gonna own these long-term, 100-year, maybe even zero coupon, zero interest U.S. government bonds to help us finance our debt. And if you're in the club, that's what you do. If you're not in the club, then we're going to impose tariffs on your goods and services. It seems it was just an idea a couple of months ago. And now as you look and see this constant threat of tariffs all over the world right now, I'm looking at this thinking, this is not an idea. They seem to actually be taking this out in the real world and saying, no, we're actually going to have this Mar-a-Lago Accord and have a reset of the global financial system. And it's a pretty high risk. It's a very high risk gamble.
Are people going to sign up? Are foreign countries going to sign up for zero yielding 100-year bonds?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Who wouldn't sign up for that? Look, it's not the 1970s anymore. In the 1970s, they could go up and say, what are you going to do, Italy? What are you going to do, Austria? I mean, you're a pipsqueak. You're a tiny little country. Well, now you've got this big, grand European Union. You've got China. You've got still these little annoying menaces. You've got Iran. You've got Russia. You've got the BRICS countries, these kind of mini alliances. So it's not to say that
I mean, is France going to bomb the Houthis? So this was what they just opened up the Suez Canal, right? By bombing these the rebels from Yemen.
Yeah, they obliterated these guys.
Right.
And that's, again, to the Europeans have this view, right? I mean, the encrypted but not classified text messages between a bunch of Trump administration officials, where this dude reporter from the Atlantic just ended up being part of the chat room, which is weird. And
Yeah.
JD Vance is saying, I hate this. I don't want to bail out the Europeans again, et cetera, et cetera. And that's again, that's not a crazy view to say, why are we bailing out Europe? 3% of our trade goes to the US canal, like 90% of their trade goes to the US canal, whatever the number is. It's clearly more their problem than it is our problem, and they're not doing anything about it. Why are we doing this? And that's not a crazy view. The Europeans, on the other hand, say, excuse me, you guys have a $36 trillion debt, and you do all these crazy financial shenanigans all the time, and we just look the other way. We go, oh, la 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 la, fine. We keep buying your stupid debt. We keep buying all this stuff. Yeah, you're going to bomb the Houthis. That's your responsibility. And it was never really, there's never said in the Bretton Woods Convention, the treaty, that America has to bomb the Houthis. There was never in that, right? But it sort of became the implied, hey, you're not backed by gold. You have this crazy deficit. You have this government, you have this Congress that can't freaking make a decision. Yeah, that's your responsibility. You guys got to do that. And that's not a crazy position either. And so what you have now are these two sides who both of them are kind of simultaneously have valid points. And they also think the other side is evil and crazy, and you're a Nazi and you're a weakling. And,
Actually, I got to say about that whole you're a Nazi thing, if any of that's coming from Europe, it's just not true. You don't export the defense of your country to somebody that you think is a Nazi. So anybody that actually, this is kind of an interesting point, right?
It's
because
a fair
they've
point.
depended on the United States for so long. The United States isn't going to invade them. They know that. They actually have absolute trust that the United States is not Nazi. So that's kind of just one interesting point I always thought was a little funny, that you would beef up your defense if you actually thought the United States was a threat. But
yeah, how stupid are you then? Yeah, exactly. That's a fair point. Yeah. So, I mean, the idea is as I wrote about it the other day, it's this is what divorce looks like. In divorce court, they call this irreconcilable differences. It's you ever been in a bad relationship where it's the other person says something, they can say hello, and you just hear I hate you. And no matter what they say, you're just not hearing each other. You're not talking to each other anymore. You're talking past each other. This is what this looks like. It looks like a really bad, toxic relationship. And there's no compromise. There's no listening to one another. And it's breaking down very rapidly in front of our very eyes. And so what you have is the French president, Macron. I love to say that name. This guy's calling for this whole new paradigm shift, and we need to be a world leader in AI and quantum computing and all these different things. He says out loud, he said it's absurd that Europe sends hundreds of billions of euros every year to the United States to buy US government bonds. And he's like, why the hell are we doing that? Why aren't we investing that surplus right here in Europe in our own economies? Why are we sending this money to the US so they could pay people to stay home and cower in fear in their basements and not go to work? So they can finance, some crazy, wokey nonsense, or they could just lose it, or they could spend $100 billion of military equipment and just give it to the Taliban, or all these crazy things that the US government does with other people's money. Why are we doing that? That's nuts. And then you have this guy who's supposedly the incoming German chancellor, although they're still a month away from that. But his party, they won the election, and he lied to all the voters, said, oh no, we're going to keep the balanced budget amendment. The first thing this guy did after winning the election is they went and tinkered with the balanced budget amendment, which is kind of sacrosanct in German society for a really long time. And they said, we're never going back to hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic. We're going to have a balanced budget. We're going to be fiscally responsible. Germans have built that reputation. They said, no, forget that. We're going to go into debt. We're going to run up the debt, baby. And now they're going to go out and dump $1 trillion on all this stuff, from defense spending to green nonsense, crazy climate initiatives, whatever it is. And they just spend. And so this is a new thing. We haven't seen this before out of Europe. We haven't seen this aggressive level of domestic spending, debt-fueled domestic spending in Europe, to be specifically to meet the lack of U.S. cooperation and foreign threats, et cetera. So it certainly doesn't look like Europe is going along with the Mar-a-Lago Accord.
We actually had a question from one of our readers that was asking if you thought that the United States preventing Germany from taking care of its own defense after World War II for obvious reasons, does that feed into why the United States was responsible for Germany's and others' defense for so long? Or is that 80 years ago? So it's like, no, that is.
No, for sure. I mean, initially it was the same thing with Japan. I mean, after they smoked Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I mean, part of the deal was like, well, you're not allowed to have a military. So I mean, they have. I mean, this is what always happens in wars. There's always these strings attached. In the same way that they kind of smacked John Maynard Keynes around at the Bretton Woods Convention, said, no, you're not allowed to have exclusive trading rights with your own colony because we're the big dog and we get to call all the shots. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things about World War II that I think informed, current events and German culture. It's the same reason why, Germany, especially at a government level, they have such a bad taste in their mouth about the Nazi regime from so long ago that they opened their arms to all these foreign migrants that came in because they don't want to be like the Nazis. They're so, I mean, it's a little bit crazy, but I mean, they're so crazy about not being Nazis that they do something that's self-destructive, say, oh, let's have in all these bazillions of refugees that aren't going to assimilate to German culture, and let's just shell out all this money in public welfare to pay for them and all this stuff because we don't want to be like the Nazis. It's like, well, okay, you can be like the Nazis, or you can not be like the Nazis and still have secure borders. You can not be like the Nazis and still have sensible immigration policy. You know what I mean? It's like, you don't have to show the world, I'm not a Nazi, by allowing everybody on the planet to come and freeload off of your economy. I mean, it's kind of insane. And that was one of the reasons why German voters in this very recent election sort of rejected the old party and said, no, we want the conservatives. And the first damn thing the conservatives did was said, let's run up the debt. Let's get rid of let's amend the balanced budget amendment in our constitution so that we can run up the debt and have this spending bonanza in our domestic economy because we don't like what Donald Trump is doing. So this is a breakdown of that post-war order, and it's happening in front of our very eyes.
And like you said, Europe is preparing to stand on its feet. So it might be a miscalculation that they're all just going to say, okay, the United States can continue to provide our security and we'll buy these terrible bonds. So what happens then?
Yeah, is Europe going to go in for that? Probably not. Is Russia going to go in for that? Doubtful. Is China going to go in for that? No, probably not. So you look at the largest economies in the world. Are they going to bend the knee to the Mar-a-Lago Accord and sign up for 100-year, coupon-free, yield-free U.S. government bonds? Probably not. So the guys who, I mean, if you read Stephen Moran's actual work, this is a very intelligent person. He has different ideas. I think a lot of his ideas are factually inaccurate. I mean, they have this view that if these guys don't go along with it, well, we're just gonna beat them over the head with tariffs. And his view, which is shared by the President of the United States, is that tariffs don't actually cause any adverse economic consequences. To be fair, he cites this example and he said, well, look what happened in 2018, 2019, just recently in the first Trump administration. They imposed tariffs on China and, prices didn't rise to the roof. And the reason why is because there was some currency adjustment. And so if you think about it, you go, okay, well, let's say, you're a U.S. merchant and you're buying goods and services from China. And all of a sudden now that stuff costs you 10% more because they impose, like, say, some 10% tariff. Okay, well, now in U.S. dollar terms, you're paying 10% more. But now the Chinese go, oh, well, we got to protect our export sector. We got to protect our manufacturers. So we're going to devalue the currency by 10%. So you have a 10% increase in prices, but you have a 10% drop in the value of the Chinese currency. So in US dollar terms, right, those two things kind of offset each other. And the devaluation of the foreign currency, because they're trying to protect their exporters, right? You have,
so you're saying it actually the 10% would actually make the exports or the imports into the United States from China go down.
It makes the Chinese currency cheaper in US dollar terms. So I'm paying more renminbi per unit because of the tariff, but I'm getting more renminbi for my dollar because of the devaluation, right? So the price of the product goes up, but the amount of renminbi I'm getting for my currency, for my US dollar, also increases, and those two things offset each other. So in US dollar terms, basically, this is what Moran writes, is in US dollar terms, the cost of Chinese products didn't really go up at all. And if you look at the rate of inflation in 2018, 2019, it was nothing. It was low. It was below 2%. So big deal, right? We can have tariffs and it's not going to be a problem because, oh, the other country is going to devalue their currency. And why are they going to devalue their currency? Because if they don't devalue the currency, then their exports are going to drop, and their economy is going to fall, and they're going to have all these problems, and unemployment's going to rise and all these sorts of things. So, hey, they're going to devalue their currency. And that's a pretty big gamble. And you could say, all right, maybe you got away with that in 2018, 2019, because the Chinese weren't prepared for it. They didn't think you'd actually do it. And, it wasn't a huge devaluation on their part, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a different game now. Now they're ready for it. They're prepared for it. And now you're talking about doing it not just on China, but on the entire world. You talk about doing it on Europe, on Canada, on Mexico, nobody knows. Like, well, okay, we'll find out next week. We'll find out on April 2nd who's going to have the tariffs and who's not going to have the tariffs. And so when you talk about threatening the entire world, do you honestly think that the entire world is going to devalue their currency in order to get around your tariffs? Like, that's quite a gamble. That's quite a gamble. So they're gambling that either the rest of the world is going to bend the knee and say, sure, sign us up for your Mar-a-Lago Accord, sign us up for your 100-year government bonds and all these things that you want us to do, and we'll do that. And so please don't impose tariffs on our goods and services. Or they'll devalue their currency so that there's basically no inflationary impact to all that stuff. They're banking on one of those two things. So, like, no matter what, they say, hey, no matter what, we win. What they're not planning on is everybody else saying, all right, to hell with you. Fine, impose your tariffs. We don't care. We'll trade with one another. Big deal. Okay, yeah, we'll suffer a little bit, but you'll probably suffer a lot. Or they still export this stuff to the United States, but it's 25% more expensive. Voters in the United States get furious because, people let's be honest, people went to the voting booth in November and they voted for lower prices. They voted for Senate. They voted for an end to this woke stuff. They voted for secure borders. They voted for an end to the migrant craze, and they voted for lower prices. They voted to actually do something about inflation. And they're not planning on this. It's just, if you read Stephen Moran's writings, they don't talk about, oh yeah, well, what if there's inflation? In fact, they say there's not going to be any inflation. Tariffs won't be inflationary. We'll generate government revenue off of this.
Yeah.
And it's like, dude, there's this whole case that you're not even planning on.
So what happens if that?
Well, their backup plan is to go, okay, the worst possible scenario would be that people say, to hell with the United States, and they dump dollars, they dump treasury bonds, and we've got to figure out how to pay for that. But basically, we're just going to rely on the central bank. We're going to go to the Federal Reserve and we'll say, hey, print all this money and buy all these government bonds. And the Federal Reserve basically just prints money to buy up all these US government bonds. And it's like, that's your solution? Yeah, they did that in 2021, 2022, and we got 9% inflation. They printed $5 trillion and we got 9% inflation, right? So, how much inflation is it going to be if the Fed has to step in and print all this money to buy up all these US government bonds that are being dumped by foreigners? And they just kind of go, oh, no, it's not good. There's no problem there. It's not going to be inflationary. And it's just like, how do you not plan on that? To them, it's like this whole thing is like, oh, we can't lose, man. We can't lose. There's no way. Everything's going to be fine. Like, we're going to win no matter what. And so it's a very high risk maneuver. I think, I think foreign countries are probably banking on the fact that voters in next year's midterm elections are going to be outrageously furious about higher prices that are going to result from tariffs. And I think that's what they're banking on. And it's probably going to be the US that backs down. But all these things ultimately constitute a reset of the financial system. Our financial system, the global financial system, is supposed to be Federal Reserve independence. The Fed is not supposed to be this political stooge that just clicks its heels and salutes whenever the president or Congress says, oh, we want you to do this. The Fed's supposed to operate independently. And what these guys are getting together saying, no, forget about Fed independence. No. The Fed should be basically a political instrument. That in and of itself is a fundamental reset of the global monetary order. Let alone like all the, replacing treasury bonds with zero coupon, non-transferable, 100-year, US government bonds. It's just that all this stuff constitutes a massive reset of the financial system. And these guys are just going, no, we can't lose, man. There's no consequences here. And that's not only is that naive, it's extremely high risk. Yeah, it's possible that everybody bends the knee. It's possible Europe says, oh, we want to get in bed with America again. We want to reconcile. We want to kiss and make up. Canada, Mexico, Australia, everybody, just says, oh yeah, hey, we want to get in bed with America again. Maybe that happens, right? But if it doesn't, boy, there's some potential consequences here, and they're not even thinking about it. And that's a little bit crazy.
You were also talking about one of the pieces, if they included it in the Mar-a-Lago Accord, access to United States assets, including perhaps technology. Is that something that could make this a viable? So you just shut out anybody from the United States markets that don't want to be part of this?
If you think back to what they did in the 1970s, right? And they went to Saudi Arabia and they said, you're going to price your oil in US dollars and create all this basically artificial demand for US dollars. They engineered the demand by having oil priced in US dollars. And now anybody that wants oil, which is everybody on the planet, has to have US dollars. Well, they have the same thing now in the United States. It's in the US. It's not in Saudi Arabia. It's in the US. And to be clear, I don't like the idea of these Mar-a-Lago Accords. I don't like tariffs. I think they're a stupid idea. But if they were to ask me and say, well, what do you think? How do we make this Mar-a-Lago Accord better? I would say, you guys are missing the obvious point here, right? The oil of today is technology. It's high performance computing and AI chips, all these things that are basically produced by US companies. Right now, they're being manufactured in Taiwan, which actually makes Taiwan pretty vital. But I mean, eventually here over the next couple of years, they're going to be produced in the United States. They're building a lot of those plants now. US technology is the equivalent of oil in the 1970s. Everybody in the 1970s had to have oil. Otherwise, they were just going to perish as a civilization. So every country who needed oil, which was everybody, had to own US dollars. Today, the oil of today is technology, and most of that technology is in the United States. And so I think if they ask me, I'd say, I think the Mar-a-Lago Accords are stupid, but if you're going to go down this road, if you want to dangle that extra carrot in front of everybody and say, join our little, new club of nations, get access to the US domestic market, get access to, guarantees of security from the US military, but most importantly, we'll give you our technology. We can give you some military technology. We can give you our chip technology. We can give you AI technology. We have all these things, robotics, all these things that are in the US are the best in the world. China has some great technology. Don't get me wrong. China has some great technology. Europe has some good technology. China's ahead in the supercomputing game for sure. But most of the most advanced technology in the world is in the United States. The best, greatest amount of the best intellectual technology on the planet is still in the United States. And that's the oil of today. They could go and make that deal with this club nation, say, hey, Europe, oh, you want these chips? You want to do your little AI, Macron? You want to do your little AI? Guess what you need? You need these freaking chips. So sign up to our deal, and we'll give you some chips.
Continue to hold the US dollar, hold it in this terrible...
Continue to hold the dollar, buy this stupid 100-year bond, and we'll send the Marines after you if you need. We'll do these things. We'll protect you from the Russians. We'll protect you from the whatever, all these things. Since you're clearly incapable of doing that yourself. Oh, Britain, you've got 25 main battle tanks? Yeah, we'll take care of you too. And we'll give you some chips. Sign the deal, right? So they actually kind of have the authority to do that. And that's the thing, when I read the blueprint of this Mar-a-Lago Accord, I go, my God, how are these guys missing this? You have the ultimate carrot here that you can dangle in front of all these nations and say, sign the deal and we'll give you our technology. And that's a big deal, but you got to keep using the US dollar because, hey, our technology is priced in US dollars. And that's one of the ways they could do it. I think it would be a stupid idea. I don't like anything about it. But if you're going to do it, either do something or don't do it. And if you're going to do this Mar-a-Lago thing, at least do it right. And this is a way to do it.
And this sounds like a macro version of what we've been talking about with real assets, how paper money, who wants euros, who wants dollars, you only want that in reference to what you can get physically for it. And sure, that, like you said, that's oil and that's rare earth minerals and things like that. But technology is the next step, the small scale nuclear, the manufacturing that can be done in the United States, as long as you don't have to employ American workers, as long as it's all automated. And so they would have a huge advantage there.
Yeah, I mean, I think for 50 years, since the early 1970s, global trade is dependent on paper. Right? People settle their current account surpluses and deficits with these pieces of paper, primarily US dollars. And what we're witnessing in real time is this massive degradation of the trust and the community of relationships that have existed for 5 decades. And it's just disintegrating in the course of a month. It's been a month, and it's just crazy how quickly things have taken place here. And so in that kind of world where cooperation is breaking down, trust and confidence is breaking down, what do you do? What do you rely on? Not pieces of paper, because people are going to go, what do I want to hold dollars for? What do I want to hold euros for? Why would I possibly want to hold Chinese renminbi? That sounds crazy, right? So what matters on a macro level, it's real assets, because real assets are the actual vital, critical things that an economy needs. It includes things like rare earth metals. You got to have them. You need energy. You need these certain things. And, we talked about gold. We talk about gold a lot, and not because I'm a gold bug. I'm not a gold bug per se, but I just see the obvious catalyst here, because in this world where trade's breaking down, the cooperation's breaking down, the trust and confidence is breaking down, people don't want to hold the pieces of, foreign governments and central banks don't want to hold US dollars, US debt, US securities anymore. What are they going to hold? Right? Gold. They're going to hold gold. And this is why they do it, because gold, just in the same way that US dollars have a long-standing tradition, gold has a really long-standing tradition. US dollars go back decades, gold goes back thousands of years. And central banks have been holding gold literally since the very first central bank was created in Sweden and then the UK. I mean, hundreds of years ago, central banks have owned gold. And so this is what's kind of keeping the gold price high and driving it higher, is central banks that are just buying gold. China's buying gold. Poland's buying gold. All these central banks around the world are buying gold, and they're buying gold with US dollars. They're getting rid of their dollars and they're buying gold. And so that's a strategic asset as well. And so I think that in this kind of economy where trust and confidence is breaking down, the thing that these central banks want to own, the foreign governments want to own, is like the real stuff, critical resources. And again, this includes energy, includes rare earths, includes gold, includes some of these things. It even includes, honestly, food and farmland. But I think especially, and the thing that the US has more than any place else, is technology, is productive technology. Because with that productive technology, right? I wrote about this, like, you can see a future where, this isn't like some crazy sci-fi thing. Again, I call it like it's the Star Trek civilization. But it's kind of in front of us, right? You've got nuclear power, small-scale nuclear reactors, super efficient, super clean, generate electricity for nothing. And that's what ultimately drives people to electric vehicles. It's not Joe Biden. It's not stupid-ass Gavin Newsom or Greta Thunberg. It's the economics. It's the fact that you'll be able to fill up your car with electrons so much cheaper than you can fill up your car with hydrocarbon molecules.
So ironic that these people, if they had just embraced nuclear, could have naturally provided the incentive, the capitalist incentive to own an electric vehicle. And they're like, no nuclear, but force you to buy an electric vehicle.
Force you to buy electric vehicles, right. And so people are going to figure out, when nuclear power gets rolled out, the cost of electricity is so cheap that you'll be able to fill up your car with electrons for almost nothing, compared to actually having to pay for hydrocarbon molecules and put oil or gas, whatever, into your vehicle, that it's so much cheaper. And because it's cheaper to fill up your car with electrons, people will buy electric vehicles because it's just more cost effective. You can buy the car up front, drive it around for years and years, and basically almost never have to pay for fuel, because it's going to be so cheap because of small-scale nuclear reactors. Small-scale nuclear reactors will also make it possible to power factories for almost nothing. And these factories will be automated with AI and robots, and that's going to drive the cost of manufacturing in the US down to almost nothing. And so you'll be able to produce everything in the United States for so cheap, and the US will be this manufacturing powerhouse as a result of cheap energy, robotic technology, AI technology, all this stuff. And like, this is the sort of thing that's possible. You're talking, and that carries over into everything, right? You're going to have the cost of construction plummet, and you're going to have houses that are bigger, much more luxurious, cheaper, because of this technology that exists. So people basically are just better off. It's the same thing if you compare your life now to a medieval peasant. You had one pair of clothes on your back. You had to miss meals a lot. You were always scrimping for food. You had this tiny little, mud floor hovel and all this stuff. And now we have these like comparatively large homes and live like kings, compared to medieval times. People are going to look back in the future when we have this super cheap nuclear energy, the robotic technology, all the AI automation and implementation. They can look back even on the way we live today and say, well, they were peasants back in the early 2020s and the mid 2020s. They were peasants, because everything's just going to be, the car's going to be nicer, the house is going to be nicer, the food's going to be more abundant, the clothes are going to be more abundant, everything's going to be more abundant, cheaper, all this stuff, because of all this technology. That's what's possible. And who's making all that technology? Well, there's a lot of places in the world, but who has the most of it? The US. The
But
U.S.
in
has
this
most of it.
scenario, it almost seems like none of this talk about the debt and the deficit even matters. It's like, well, who cares? If it's going to be that productive and there's going to be that
Fingers
much
crossed, buddy.
boom, I guess,
Fingers,
right. We don't know.
yeah.
We don't know that that's going to
Yeah,
happen
of
yet.
course. I mean, it's everything I outlined is a possible future, right? Is a possible future. There would also be people that would say, well, there's also a future where we'd be all of us enslaved by AI and our robots, all this stuff. There's always going to be a concern about that. It's a concern that, who knows? I mean, war could break out. There's all kinds of things that could happen. And yeah, like it's a question of the race against the clock. It's how, can you at least stave off the problem long enough for this productivity bonanza to take place and create all this benefit in the US economy and the global economy? Is that possible? Yeah, it's possible, but hey, maybe you should stop with the tariffs.
Yeah, so it's like
let's stop with the trade wars.
On the Mar-a-Lago Accord, just focus on deregulation.
Deregulation, productivity growth, and cutting the friggin' deficit. That's the key. The private economy is more than capable of lifting itself, all these things. I mean, again, like we talk about, they do this happy dance when U.S., real inflation adjusted GDP increases by 3%. 3% is a joke. It's a joke. And yet somehow we've been constrained to this idea that 3% is this like we pat ourselves on the back and say, yeah, 3%. 3% is a joke. We should be ashamed of 3% growth. It's a shame with the amount of technology, talent, investment capital sitting on the sidelines for the U.S. economy growing 3% is a joke. And so if these guys would actually do the right thing and say, let's cut the deficit, let's slash all of these idiotic regulations, and some of that's happening, right? But, I think we need to see a lot more focus on that than let's make Canada the 51st state, which, by the way, is a stupid idea because then you're just going to get a whole bunch more Democratic senators.
Yeah.
Let's then you have more, let's pack the Supreme Court and all that stupid stuff. So just terrible idea. Focus on what matters.
So much potential.
Right. So go out and get it.
Absolutely. Thanks, James.
Okay, bud.